Hey you sitting on the toilet watching this video, I know what you're thinking. Oh boy, I have nothing else to do other than pushing a baguette out my bum, so you know what? Let's watch a video about coding to give myself a foot ahead of everybody else in the computer science industry. Because odds are you probably think coding is boring and only want to pick it up just because it makes some good moolah. Welcome to an average guide on how to program in C++.
Colors weave into a spire of flame. Distant sparks call to a past still unnamed. Bear this torch against the cold of the night. Search your soul and reawaken the undying light.
So you want to make some programs but can't figure out how to do it right. What you need to do is add some loop in your life. Want to make a program repeat until your computer suddenly shits itself and dies from your lack of RAM? Slap a loop in your code. Want to know how to make your failing marriage work? Loop your actions so you can keep doing all the wrong things again to make the divorce process even faster. Want to know how to make a SoundCloud rapper bow down to your musical genius? Just add loops of random hi-hats and snares and suddenly you're an objectively bad rapper but everyone thinks they're hot shit. So if you haven't noticed already, the subject of this video is on loops, one of the most useful tools that you can use in all of your programs. Loops are a block of code that tells the program that you have written to execute lines of code that you have embedded within the loop repeatedly, either infinitely like your parents telling you to do the chores, or for a certain number of times like going to the gym. This of course can be set within the declaration line for your loop. Basically, loops are the important part of your LEGO Star Wars set that you had to put together in order for your Death Star to actually look like a Death Star. The declaration line of a loop is especially important unless you want your loop to be as useless just like the cries in said language subtitles. You of course need to make sure that the parameters within your loop will allow for the loop to do its job when it's needed. But of course, there are multiple types of loops. There's the for loop, which keeps track of all the times it loops, like someone on a diet keeping track of all the calories they eat. This loop has three parts in its header: the declaration and initialization of some random variable as a counter, the declaration of that counter to be less than or greater than a variable that you have declared earlier in your code, and the code to increment or decrement the counter variable. The for loop is especially helpful when counting finite and concrete numbers, like the amount of girlfriends I've had in my life. There's the while loop, which keeps going until you suddenly say something that you weren't supposed to, and then just looks at you disgustedly because you killed their vibe. Then there's the do while loop that has to take a second to decide whether it wants to stop or not, like that one friend of yours who laughs a little bit and then stops immediately after you've told an edgy joke. The while and do while loops are used mainly when you're unsure of how many times you want your line of code to repeat. These loops are used in conjunction with input lines, as the input will be taken into account when the loop looks at their parameters to determine if they will loop again or not. If the input that the program takes does not follow the parameters defined in the declaration line of that loop, it will refuse to run. All these loops are basically the same and have the same function as each other while being very useful, just like all the different types of Pokeballs there are. These loops can also be interchanged with each other, just like your desktop backgrounds, depending on how you feel a certain day. A for loop can be written in the form of a while loop and a do while loop, and the same applies to while and do while loops as well. Loops are especially helpful when you use them to print out arrays, because they're the only ones that can do so, like Overpowered Character with Spells is the only character in popular fighting game that I don't play that can abuse RNG and get away with it. Loops can also be used to repeat functions as well, which is helpful and can clear up unneeded clutter from excess code to make your code a bit less messy. But of course, this wouldn't be a proper guide unless I taught you how to actually use this knowledge correctly. Don't worry about my teaching methods, because they're better than any DIY video you'll find on any platform. Now let's start off with for loops. Let's create a program that helps print out all the numbers, including 0 up to the number that you'll input. We'll assume that you already know the basics of coding and that you clicked on this video just to learn what loops are, so let's get right into the code. Now this is where everything gets serious. We'll first have to define a variable. It will have to be an integer specifically for this program, and we'll name this integer input and set it to 0. Pretty basic. After that, we'll output a statement asking for the user to input any real number. A real number is any number from infinity to negative infinity as defined by every math class in middle school and above. After that, we'll ask for user input. We then set an if-else statement so that the program will correctly output all the numbers before any positive and negative number that you type into the console. In the if statement, we will put into the parentheses if our input is greater than 0. After that, we'll then write the for loop, starting off by declaring it and then typing in all the parameters. We set int I equal to 0, I to be less than or equal to our output, and then increment I after every loop. Within the for loop, we will output the integer I along with a comma and a space to make it more clear to read. This loop will be responsible for printing out all the numbers before a positive number that the user inputs. As for the else portion, we will use that same loop again, but this time, change I to be greater than or equal to input and then decrement it after each loop. If we test out the program, let's type in 5, we can see that the console prints out all the numbers 0 to 5. And if we rerun the program and type in a negative number, we can see the same thing. but for negatives, and that's how you use a for loop. A while and do while loop are basically the same thing, except the do while loop will run one more time than the while loop because the do while loop checks the conditions after it loops. So, for this second program, we will use both while and do while loops to show the difference in output. What we will do for this is that we will make a program that keeps taking user input until a negative number is inputted. But here's the twist. The input variable will be initially set to a negative number when the program runs. Then we will be able to see the true difference between do while and while loops. So first, all the basic setup like the previous program, then we declare a variable input as an integer and set it to -1. Then we begin to deal with the loops. We will first have an output line which will read while loop to show when the while loop begins. We will then write our while loop, making our condition being input is greater than or equal to 0. Then inside the loop, we will have a prompt which will output a statement and then another to take user input. Outside of the while loop, we will then output number as negative to show that the loop is now done due to it encountering a negative number in the user input. We will then do the same thing with the do while loop as well. And now we will test the program. When the console pops up, you will see immediately that the while loop was skipped. That is because the while loop looks at the variable before it loops. The do while loop, on the other hand, asks for user input. Due to the do while loop's loop structure, it will always run at least once, no matter what the circumstances are, and as we see here, we are able to keep on inputting numbers until we input a negative number. That is how you use a while and do while loop. Now that you have this holy knowledge, you're able to write all the useless programs that you so wish to do before you watch this video. And now you know how to use loops in C++. You're welcome.